I opened my front door expecting the usual December chill, the kind that bites your nose and makes you grateful for a warm kitchen. Instead, something heavier slipped into the house before my daughter even crossed the threshold. A feeling, a warning, the kind a father gets when he realizes he's already too late. Rachel hadn't been home in nearly a year. Work in Seattle, long hours, growing distance. I told myself it was normal. Kids grow up and drift, but the girl who stepped out of that rideshare wasn't drifting. She was running, from what she wouldn't say. Her smile cracked at the edges. Her hug felt rehearsed. And when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes kept tracing the back door like she expected someone to appear there. That was the moment I knew this Christmas would not be quiet, not gentle, not safe. Later that evening, while Laura basted the turkey and the snow piled against the windows, Rachel finally sat down at the kitchen table. She took a breath that sounded like it hurt and told us she was in love. I thought that was the confession. I thought that was the part that would demand patience and listening. But then she told us his age. Then she told us his name. And everything inside me went cold, because I knew that name. I knew the man behind it. And I knew whatever Rachel had fallen into. It wasn't love. It was something far darker. I remember the way the cold air felt when I opened the front door that afternoon. Dillon, Colorado always carried a kind of mountain stillness around Christmas. The kind that made you breathe a little deeper without thinking. I had pictured a quiet holiday this year. Nothing fancy. Just a few warm meals, a couple of board games, maybe a walk by the frozen lake if the wind wasn't too rough. After the year my family had been through, quiet felt like a gift. But the moment Rachel stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. She hugged me, but her arms were stiff, and when she pulled back, she kept a hand on her coat, like she wasn't sure she should take it off. Her eyes darted toward the back windows, then to the driveway, then back to me, as if she was checking for something she couldn't quite name. She tried to smile. It wasn't her smile. Laura came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her face lighting up the way it always did whenever Rachel came home. But even she hesitated just for a second when she saw our daughter's posture. I could tell she felt that same distance I did. Mothers pick up on it faster. We made small talk for a bit, the kind you make when everyone wants to act normal. Rachel set her bag by the stairs, glanced at her phone, then at the back door again. I asked about Seattle, about her job at the analytics firm, about her apartment in Capitol Hill. She answered everything, but with the kind of short replies that sound rehearsed. She looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from work, but the kind that comes from being afraid for too long. While Laura chopped vegetables for the roast, I stood beside Rachel at the counter and handed her a bowl of potatoes. She washed them slowly, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. I waited a moment before saying anything, because I knew if I rushed her, she'd shut down. I asked if everything was all right. The faucet kept running and she didn't answer at first. Her shoulders rose and fell. Then she shut the water off and set the bowl down. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were already glossy. She tried to say something, paused, looked away, then tried again. It was like watching a dam crack in slow motion. She said she needed to tell me something but didn't want to fight. I told her there wouldn't be one, even though I wasn't sure that was true. Laura had stopped chopping now and leaned against the counter, listening carefully. Rachel drew a breath, held it, then said she was in love. I expected there to be more. Maybe the name of someone from her office or someone she met in Seattle. Instead, what followed was a long silence. She pressed her palms together and whispered that he was older. Much older. I asked how old. She swallowed and said almost 20 years older than her. Something in my chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. People fall for older partners all the time. That part didn't scare me. It was the way she said it, the shame in her tone, the fear. Laura stepped closer and asked who the man was. Rachel closed her eyes as if preparing for impact. Then she said his name, Adrian Locke. I felt a strange heat rise in my face. I hadn't heard that name in over a year, but it still carried weight. Adrian had worked with Laura on several mental health outreach programs across Summit County. He was polished, charming, too smooth for my taste. He always talked like he was listening, but his eyes said something else, something calculating. I never had a good feeling about him, though I never said it out loud. Rachel kept her eyes on the floor after saying his name, like she was waiting for someone to yell. Neither of us did. Laura stood frozen, her hand resting on the edge of the counter. She wasn't smiling anymore. I asked how she met him again. She said it started when she went through a rough period at work, and Adrian checked in on her after hearing about it from someone in the community center. He had offered support, talked to her through late nights, helped her feel grounded again. The way she described it made my stomach twist. It was too familiar, too deliberate. Rachel said she didn't want us to judge her, that Adrian understood her in ways she didn't expect. She said he cared for her. She said he loved her. But none of those words matched the fear in her eyes. I asked how long this had been going on, and she hesitated long enough that I almost didn't want to know the answer. Finally, she said it had been serious for a while, longer than we realized. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the back windows. Inside, the house felt too still, like even the walls were listening. I looked at Laura, and she looked back at me with the same unspoken realization. Whatever this was, whatever had been happening behind the scenes, it didn't start tonight. It had been creeping toward us for a long time. Rachel took a breath and said she wanted to explain everything, but her voice cracked mid-sentence. She didn't finish. She just shook her head as if trying to dislodge a memory. That was when I knew our quiet Christmas was gone, completely gone, and whatever had followed Rachel home from Seattle. It wasn't love, not the kind she believed it was. I pulled out a chair for her, and she sat down slowly, like her legs might give out. There were 100 questions I wanted to ask, but only one came out. What exactly had Adrian told her? She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the back door one more time, as if expecting a shadow to appear in the glass. Then she whispered that it was complicated, the kind of complicated that never ends well. I did not push her after that. Years of being a father had taught me that when your kid says something is complicated, you can wrench it out of them in one messy burst, or you can sit there long enough for the truth to come out on its own. One way leaves scars, the other takes more time than you want, but it is the only way they ever trust you again. So I sat down across from Rachel at the kitchen table. Laura slipped into the chair beside her, close but not too close, the way only a mother can measure. The oven hummed in the background, and the smell of garlic and rosemary hung in the air, strange companions to the tension in that room. I told Rachel to start from the beginning. She stared at her hands for a long moment, then said, "It started back when she first moved to Seattle. New city, new job near downtown, new apartment that looked great on a rental app but felt like a hotel room once the door closed at night. She said she was exhausted, anxious, unsure she was good enough to be there. Work piled up. Her team lead was demanding. Every Sunday night felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Somebody from Summit Outreach, the nonprofit Laura volunteered with, had mentioned to Adrian that our daughter was out there on her own now. She did not know who exactly, just that he had heard, and then one day her phone lit up with a number from a Colorado area code. She almost did not answer. She did anyway. He told her he had worked with her mom, that he had heard she was in Seattle now, asked how she was doing. At first it was once a week, then every few days, then late nights when she could not sleep. She said he listened better than anyone she had ever met. He remembered details, followed up on things she had mentioned once, sent articles about burnout and stress, suggested breathing exercises when her chest got tight on the bus ride to work. I listened, and the more she talked, the more a pattern began to form. I had seen that kind of attention before, just not in my personal life. It was the same way young engineers get pulled into bad investments and stupid risks by older guys who know exactly what to say. You are special, nobody else gets you, you are safe with me. I asked how much time they had actually spent together in person. She said at first it was only phone calls and video chats. He was still living in Colorado, then still doing workshops at the community center in Dillon and in Frisco. I remembered those evenings when Laura came home talking about the great turnout or the powerful stories people had shared. Adrian had been in the background of all of that, like a helpful shadow. Later that year, Summit Outreach partnered with an organization in Seattle for a mental health series. Adrian flew out. He told her it would be nice to finally see her face to face instead of through a screen. I felt my jaw tighten. I asked her exactly when that trip had been. She hesitated. Laura looked at her, her eyes soft but searching. Rachel finally said it was about 2 years ago, right around the time she had called home less. Right around when she started saying she was too busy to visit for the holidays. Laura stepped in then. She reminded us both that Adrian had done good work in the community. He had led workshops for veterans, for high school students, for single parents. She said he had always been professional, with her polite, reliable. She said she had never once seen him act inappropriately. She said maybe we should not jump to conclusions. I knew she meant well. Laura has always believed that hurting people deserve the benefit of the doubt. It is part of what makes her good at her job. It is also the thing that keeps me awake at night. I told Rachel I was not asking her to condemn anyone. I just needed to understand. I asked her when things turned from support to something else. She stared at a knot in the wooden table, then said that on his last night in Seattle after one of his talks, they had gone for coffee. It was late, raining, the city lights reflecting off the sidewalk outside the little place near Pike Street where they sat. She said she cried that night, that she felt like she had failed at everything, and Adrian had reached across the table and held her hand. I felt something twist inside me. I imagined my daughter alone in a city 2 states away, crying in front of a man who knew every crack in her armor. She said he told her she was strong, that she was not broken, that she was carrying too much alone. He said people like me, meaning fathers, try to protect until they smother. He told her she had a right to choose her own life and her own people. He told her he cared about her, that she meant something to him beyond the outreach work. She said the way he looked at her made her feel seen for the first time in a long time. I asked if that was the night they first crossed the line. She did not answer with words, just a slow nod and a tear sliding down her cheek. Laura let out a small breath, like someone had punched the air out of her. She said Adrian had never mentioned seeing Rachel on that trip. I could hear the hurt in her voice. It was not just betrayal as a mother. It was betrayal as someone who had trusted him as a colleague. I asked why Rachel had never told us any of this. She said it was because Adrian had told her I would not understand, that I would make it about control, that I would try to take her choices away. She said he told her fathers who work in safety think everything is a risk to be managed, not a life to be lived. I sat with that for a moment, not because I believed him, but because I knew how easily those words could land in the mind of a 23-year-old who felt misunderstood. Rachel wiped her eyes and said Adrian had asked her to keep their relationship private. He did not want, in her words, drama. He said it would confuse Laura, that it might complicate the community programs, that people in Dillon would not understand. He made secrecy sound like protection. That was when something settled in me, a heavy, quiet certainty. I realized this was not an accident or a messy, sudden infatuation. This was a strategy. He had come in through the side door of our family through Laura's work, through community events and wellness nights and friendly conversations at folding tables with coffee and disposable cups. He had mapped out who we were, where our weak spots lay, and then, when Rachel moved to Seattle and the distance grew between us, he stepped into the gap. I asked Rachel one last question. I asked if she truly believed he loved her or if she believed he needed her to need him. She did not answer. Instead, she asked if we were going to forbid her from seeing him. I told her I was not going to shout or make empty threats. But I said I would not ignore what I was seeing. Outside, a plow rumbled down the street, scraping snow and ice off the asphalt. Inside, my world felt split right down the middle. Laura did not defend Adrian again. She just stared at the fridge, lost in a memory I could not reach. Rachel stood up, said she needed some air, and stepped out onto the back deck. I watched her through the glass arms wrapped around herself, the mountains rising behind her in the fading light. I had spent my whole career learning how to identify hazards before they turned into disasters. Looking at my daughter's silhouette against the snow, I understood that this time the danger had been allowed to live in our blind spot for far too long. And the man behind it had not yet even stepped into my house. That night, after Rachel came back in from the deck, the house felt split into two worlds. Outside, the snow kept falling in soft, steady sheets. Inside, the quiet had turned thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Laura went back to the stove more out of habit than hunger. She stirred a pot that did not need stirring, set the timer again, even though it had 10 minutes left. I cleared my throat and told Rachel we needed to sit down and talk, really talk, if we were going to figure any of this out. We moved into the dining room, but nobody turned the lights all the way up. The chandelier above the table glowed at half strength, throwing long shadows across the walls. Rachel sat at the end of the table, arms folded tight across her chest, her bag at her feet, like she might bolt at any second. I asked her if Adrian had said anything about a future together. Marriage, living arrangements, real plans beyond late-night calls and big ideas. She hesitated, then bent over her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. My chest tightened even before she set it on the table. You can tell a lot by the way a person places something down. This was careful, reverent, and yet tinged with doubt. She said he had asked her to marry him. Laura stopped in the doorway. For a second, she looked like she might drop the dish she was carrying. She set it down instead, slowly, and came to stand beside me. Rachel opened the box and slid the ring out onto her palm. A simple gold band, a modest diamond, nothing flashy. It caught the light just the way I remembered. It was not the first time I had seen that ring. My breath caught. Laura went still beside me, all color draining from her face. She covered her mouth with her hand. I did not need to look at her to know we were seeing the same thing. Rachel frowned, looking between us. She clearly expected surprise, maybe questions about the proposal, but not this reaction. I asked where the ring came from. She said Adrian told her he had bought it years ago, that he had been waiting for the right person. She ran a thumb over the band as if that story still comforted her. Laura reached out with trembling fingers and asked if she could hold it. Rachel let her. Laura turned the ring over in her hand, stared at the engraving inside, then closed her eyes. 3 winters ago, Laura had torn apart our bedroom looking for that ring. It had been her grandmother's, passed down through the women in her family. We had searched the bathroom drains, the laundry, the garage. She had cried that night in a way I did not know how to fix. Eventually, she convinced herself she had lost it at the grocery store or the gas station. Life moved on the way it does, but I knew it never stopped bothering her. Now it was sitting on our table, on our daughter's hand. Rachel asked what was wrong. Laura whispered that the ring was hers. Not one like it. The ring. She had worn it for nearly 20 years. Rachel stared at me at the ring, and for a long moment nothing made sense in her eyes. Then she shook her head, trying to push back the thought forming in front of her. She said there must be some mistake. Adrian would not lie about something like that. He would not take a ring from Laura and give it to her without saying where it came from. He was not that kind of man. I did not argue. Not yet. Instead, I asked if there was anything else he had asked her to sign or keep for him. Papers, agreements, anything with her name on it. She hesitated again, that same small pause I was starting to recognize, the one that meant she was deciding whether to tell the whole truth or the edited version. Finally, she reached back into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. She said this was the thing she had wanted my help with anyway, maybe after Christmas. Adrian had called it a future investment contract, something that would help them build a foundation together. She slid it across the table. The envelope was heavy, the kind of weight that never means good news. I opened it and started reading. Columns of numbers, legal language, a bank in Denver. At first glance, it looked like any other financial document, dense and boring. Then I read the title at the top and felt my stomach knot. It was not an investment contract. It was a personal loan agreement that had been modified into a guarantee. Adrian's name was listed as borrower. Rachel's name appeared in the section labeled guarantor. I looked at her signature down near the bottom. It was hers, but not quite. The letters were uneven, the pen strokes trailing off as if her hand had been shaking. I asked if she understood what it meant. She said Adrian told her it was just a formality, something to satisfy the bank, nothing that would ever come back on her. He had told her he was restructuring old student loans, consolidating some debt so they could start their life together clean. I read the terms twice more, just to be sure. If the loan went unpaid, the bank had every legal right to pursue Rachel for the full amount, $200,000 with interest. My vision narrowed for a second. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I turned to the last page. At the very bottom, beneath Rachel's shaky signature and the blank space for a witness, there was another name. Mine, in neat, familiar handwriting that I recognized from signing safety reports, insurance forms, paychecks for the last 30 years. Except this one was too perfect. No small hesitations, no pressure marks. Just a clean, flat version of my name. I knew immediately what I was looking at. That was not ink. That was an image. I told Laura to look. She leaned in and covered her mouth again, this time, with a different kind of shock. She had been present when I signed dozens of documents over the years, most of them linked somehow to her work at the community center. Copies of my signature existed on grant applications, liability waivers, even simple attendance forms. Always trying to help, I had signed whatever needed signing, trusting that the paperwork was harmless. Rachel looked at both of us and whispered that she had never seen my name on the document before. Adrian had only shown her the pages where she needed to sign. He had told her he would take care of the rest with the bank. I leaned back in my chair, the memory landing like a stone in a pond. Last fall, Summit Outreach held a charity dinner at a hotel in Denver. Adrian had been the main speaker. During the evening, he had asked to borrow my phone. He said he wanted to pull up a slide deck he had forgotten to email himself. I handed it over without thinking. He was gone with it for 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a long time in the hands of a man who knows he has your trust. I could picture him now, stepping into a quiet hallway, opening my email, downloading old attachments, saving scanned documents with my signature. All it would take is one photo, unclear shot in a cheap editing program. The ring, the contract, the way he had come into our lives through Laura's work, then moved toward Rachel when she was at her lowest. How neatly it all lined up. Rachel looked from the ring in Laura's hand to the papers in mine. For the first time since she started talking about Adrian, I saw something crack open behind her eyes, a small fracture in the belief she had been holding on to. She asked if we thought he had planned all of this, if he had ever really cared about her, or if she had just been another step in some long pattern we did not fully see yet. I did not answer her right away, not because I did not have an opinion, but because I knew that admitting what I believed would hurt her more than she was ready for. I closed the folder and told her we would find out, that we were not going to guess. We were going to know. Laura set the ring down carefully on the table between us. For the first time, it looked less like a symbol of love and more like evidence in a case that none of us had realized we were already part of. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, I felt a different kind of weight settling in. This was no longer only about feelings or bad judgment. This was about someone crossing a line into something deliberate and dangerous. And if I wanted to keep my daughter from disappearing into whatever this man had built around her, I was going to have to start treating it that way. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was still the kind of winter quiet where you can hear the baseboard heat ticking and the occasional car passing far off on the main road. Laura was asleep beside me on her side of the bed, one arm thrown over her forehead. Rachel was down the hall behind a closed door, finally worn out from crying. I stared at the ceiling for a long minute, then swung my feet to the floor. Lying there thinking about Adrian was not going to change anything. If I wanted answers, I was going to have to dig in the hallway closet. We kept an old metal filing cabinet, the kind that had moved with us from Denver to Dillon and never quite fit in with the mountain cabin furniture. Inside were 15 years of our life on paper. Tax returns, insurance claims, school records, grant applications from Laura's outreach work. I pulled the drawer open and started flipping through folders. I was looking for anything with Adrian's name on it. A grant form, a program proposal, a note Laura might have scrawled and tucked away. It felt intrusive sifting through my wife's paperwork, but the thought of that ring on our daughter's hand pushed me on. Halfway through a stack labeled Community Center, a slip of yellow paper slid loose and fluttered onto my knee. It was torn from a notepad folded once. I recognized Laura's handwriting before I even opened it. Grant, I am worried Adrian is getting too close to Rachel. No date, no explanation, just that one sentence. I sat there on the carpet with the closet door pressing into my shoulder and read it 3 times. Laura had written that and then never given it to me. She had thought it, she had seen something, and she had stayed quiet. I slid the note into my pocket and closed the cabinet. In the kitchen, the coffee maker sputtered to life as the first light crept over the ridge outside the windows. I could hear Laura moving around upstairs. I took the ring from where we had left it on the dining room table and carried it to my small office at the back of the house. The desk lamp in there was bright and unforgiving, the kind electricians use when they need to see every wire clearly. I set the ring in the circle of light and leaned in. Inside the band, just as I remembered, were tiny engraved letters. But they were not the letters I expected. Years ago, for our anniversary, I had taken that same ring to a jeweler in Denver and had the inside engraved with a simple phrase and a date. The phrase was gone now, ground away. In its place was a newer line, sharper, less worn. A date from the past spring. I did not have to ask what date that was. Rachel had already told us when Adrian proposed. Something about seeing that new engraving where my words used to be made my chest ache in a way that surprised me. It was not just anger. It was grief. Grief for the years Laura had worn that ring, for the trust we had extended to a man who had taken something from my wife's hand and turned it into a prop in his performance for my daughter. Behind me, I heard a step in the doorway. Rachel stood there, hair pulled into a loose knot wrapped in one of my old flannel shirts. She looked smaller in that light, younger. She asked if I was still angry. I told her anger was not a big enough word for what I felt. Then I asked her a different question. I asked her now that she had seen the ring and the contract if anything about the past 2 years looked different. She leaned against the doorframe and thought for a while. She said that Adrian had always had perfect timing. He texted when she felt overwhelmed at work. He called on nights she felt lonely. He suggested coffee just when she was thinking of quitting. At the time, she thought it was something like fate. Now she said it felt more like surveillance. She remembered him asking for her schedule in Seattle, offering to check in after big presentations, asking when she would be home on weekends. She had thought it was caring. Now she was not so sure. Laura joined us a few minutes later, still in her robe. I handed her the yellow note from my pocket. She read it, closed her eyes, then sat down on the edge of the desk chair. She admitted she had written it 1.5 years ago. Adrian had made a comment at a volunteer event about how grown-up Rachel looked, how hard it must be to let go of a daughter that beautiful. Laura said it had put a stone in her stomach, but when she brought it up in passing, I had brushed it off. She had torn the note out to give me, then changed her mind, afraid we would fight about her work again. So she tucked it into a file and tried to convince herself she was overreacting. Regret hung heavy in the room, but I did not throw it back in her face. There were enough mistakes scattered between us already. After breakfast, I called someone I trusted. Michael Hart and I had gone to high school together in Denver before life took us in different directions. He had gone into law enforcement, worked his way up, and now wore a badge as the sheriff of Summit County. When I heard his voice on the line, I felt that small grounding you get when you talk to someone who remembers who you were before everything got complicated. I told him I needed to ask a hypothetical question about a mental health consultant and some questionable behavior. There was a pause on the other end that told me he already knew who I meant before I said the name. He asked how deep we were in. I told him about the ring, about the contract, about the signature, about Rachel. He swore softly under his breath, then said Adrian had been the subject of a few complaints in the past, nothing that had stuck. People feeling uncomfortable, a boundary crossed here and there, but no one wanting their name on an official report. Michael said that if what I was describing was true, this was more than discomfort now. But he also warned me that men like Adrian did not go down easily. They were careful. They stayed just on the safe side of the line until the moment they thought no one was looking. We hung up with him, promising to reach out to a contact in Denver who had handled similar cases. He told me to save every document, every text, every small detail. Sometimes it is the small things that tip a case over. That night, after we had forced our way through dinner and pretended to watch a movie none of us could follow, I checked the porch camera. It had motion alerts set to my phone, but the afternoon had been busy and I had ignored the buzzes. The footage was in grainy black and white. Snow specks drifted across the frame like static. For hours it was nothing but wind bending the trees and the occasional car headlights passing down the street. Then around 11, a figure stepped into view near the corner of the house. A man bundled in a coat and hat, face indistinct in the darkness. He did not come to the door. He did not ring the bell. He stood near the side of the house where the downstairs bedroom window was, the one Rachel was using while she was home. He stood there for almost a minute, motionless, head tilted slightly as if listening. Then he disappeared back into the shadows. I replayed that segment 3 times. The shape, the height, the way he moved. You spend enough time watching someone on a stage at community events, you learn their silhouette. I did not show Rachel that night. There was only so much one person could take in a day. I only watched it alone in my office, the lamp off now, the screen glow, the only light. Any illusion that this was still something that lived out in Seattle or in the past was gone. Whoever Adrian Locke thought he was to my daughter, he had brought it all the way to our front door. And for the first time, I started to wonder just how many corners of our lives he had already stepped into without us noticing. Once you see a shadow in one corner of the room, you start looking for it everywhere. That is how it felt after I watched the porch camera. Instinct was not enough anymore. I needed facts, something solid that did not care how much I loved my daughter. The next day, I called a man named Nolan Briggs. We had never worked together, but his name came up when I asked Michael if he knew any attorney who understood both money and people. Michael said Nolan had handled some ugly financial messes for folks around Summit County. The kind where the contracts were legal on paper but rotten underneath. Nolan agreed to meet me in his small office in Frisco. It was in one of those older buildings off Main Street, wedged between a ski rental place and a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans. He was in his 60s, sharp eyes behind scratched reading glasses, no nonsense in his handshake. I laid everything on his desk, the loan contract, photocopies of the ring documentation from when Laura had it appraised years ago, notes about Adrian, what Rachel had told us, the fact he had given her a ring that had already belonged to my wife. Nolan read quietly for a long time, lips moving just barely as he traced the sentences. Every now and then he would grunt in that way people do when something confirms what they suspected. Finally, he sat back and asked if he could run Adrian's name through a couple of databases. Public records, civil cases, liens. Nothing illegal in that, he assured me. Just information that anyone could find if they knew where to look. He disappeared into a back room with the papers and stayed there long enough for me to finish a bad cup of coffee and count every crack in his ceiling. When he came back, he had a thin stack of printouts and a tighter look on his face. He said Adrian had a string of personal loans behind him. Some current, some closed, some sent to collections. Denver, Colorado Springs, even one out of Tacoma. A few had been settled, but the pattern was always the same. He would borrow, fall behind. Then someone else's name would show up associated with the debt. Women, different ages, different towns, but always tied to the kinds of community programs he had worked on. Nolan slid one page across the desk. It showed a judgment from a few years back. Adrian and a woman from Pueblo on the hook for a line of credit. The woman had ended up paying most of it after he defaulted. Nolan tapped the page with his finger. People like this, he said, they do not steal the old-fashioned way. They do it with charm and paperwork. They let other people dig their holes for them. I drove back to Dillon with that phrase bouncing around my head. Charm and paperwork. It sounded worse than a ski mask and a gun because it meant the victims helped put their own necks in the noose. The next day I told Rachel I needed her help with one more thing. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same table that now felt like a witness. I said I wanted to drive to Spokane and look at her old therapy records. Not to invade her privacy, but to see if Adrian had been around back then in an official capacity. She hesitated, then nodded. If this would show something real, she said she wanted to know too. We called the clinic together. The woman on the phone remembered Rachel's name and said they would need her permission to release any information. Rachel gave it, voice steady but eyes cloudy. 2 days later, I was on the road heading northwest through Wyoming and into Washington, the landscape changing from brown plains to dark evergreens and gray sky. The clinic was in an older brick building near downtown Spokane. Inside, the waiting room smelled like disinfectant and peppermint tea. I checked in using Rachel's signed release and waited until a woman in a cardigan came out with a folder in her hands. She was one of the clinicians who had worked there when Rachel came in for anxiety and stress. We sat in a small office with a fake plant in the corner. She said she could not talk about the content of Rachel's sessions without her present. I told her I respected that. I only needed to know one thing. Was Adrian working there at the time? She looked at the release again, then at the notes in the folder. Yes, she said. He had been a program assistant helping with intakes and group sessions. He did not do official one-on-one therapy, but he sat in sometimes to observe. He was there during the months Rachel attended. I asked if she ever noticed anything about his behavior. She hesitated, then said there had been a conversation among staff back then about him paying too much attention to certain young women, blurring the line between professional interest and something more personal. They had talked to him informally. He had brushed it off. Then he left for another job, and without a formal complaint, it went nowhere. She looked at me over the folder and said she was sorry. The kind of sorry that comes when people realize their small doubts might have grown into someone else's life. On the long drive back to Dillon, the miles blurred. The highway hummed under the tires, and my mind kept circling the same ugly thought. This was not the first time. Rachel was not the exception. She was another link in a chain I was only now seeing the length of. When I got home, the driveway was packed with snow. I parked on the street intending to shovel a path in the morning. Laura met me at the door, worry written all over her face. She said Rachel had spent most of the day in her room, texting on and off, crying quietly when she thought no one could hear. The next afternoon I went out to start my truck. The sky was the color of old steel, and the wind cut through my coat as I crunched across the snow. I hit the unlock button on the key fob and heard the familiar chirp. When I rounded the front of the GMC, I stopped. All 4 tires sat flat on the packed snow, sagging against the rims. Someone had sliced them low and clean, no tracks nearby except mine. No note, no graffiti, just quiet, calculated damage. It did not feel like kids playing a prank. It felt like someone sending a message. I stood there for a long moment with my hands in my pockets, watching my breath cloud in front of me. Then I went back inside. Rachel was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the couch, her phone in her hand. When she saw my face, she asked what was wrong. Before I could answer, her phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen, the color drained from her cheeks. Her fingers twitched, then tightened around the phone. I asked what it said. She swallowed and handed it to me. If you let them interfere, we will lose everything. No name attached. Just a number she recognized. Laura read it over my shoulder. Her hand came up to her mouth again, that same reflex she had when she saw the ring and the contract, except now there was fear on top of the shock. Rachel whispered that Adrian must know she was home, that he must know I was looking into things. She kept saying he would not hurt us, that he was just scared, that he did not mean it like a threat. I looked at the flat tires through the window and the message still glowing on her phone. I thought about the hidden note in our filing cabinet, the scraped engraving on the ring, the loan documents with my fake signature, the clinic in Spokane, the women on Nolan's printouts. Whatever line this had been walking before, it was not a gray area anymore. Up until then, I had been treating this like a problem, to understand something I could reason my way through. Now I understood it as something else. A hazard that was no longer theoretical. A man who had crossed every boundary he should have stayed behind. I handed the phone back to Rachel and told her as calmly as I could that this had gone far enough. Suspicion had done its job. It had brought the shadows into view. Now there was only one thing left if I wanted my daughter back from this man. I was going to have to look Adrian Locke in the eye. I figured if a man wanted to rattle me by slashing my tires, I might as well show him I could still move without 4 wheels. That night I borrowed Laura's Subaru and told her I was going out for a drive to clear my head. She knew that was only half true. She asked where I was going. I said I did not know yet. That was the lie. I had already called Michael. I asked a simple question. If you were looking for a man like Adrian on a Friday night near Dillon, where would you start? Michael did not hesitate. Iron Horse Bar off Highway 40 past the gas station before you hit the canyon. It was where the professionals went when they wanted to pretend they were still blue-collar and where the blue-collar guys went when they wanted to forget about professionals. The drive out there took 15 minutes. The highway was a dark ribbon cutting through snow-covered fields. The Subaru heater rattled like it was annoyed to be working after 9 at night. My hands clenched and unclenched around the steering wheel. I pulled into the gravel lot and saw his car right away, a late model Lexus clean even under the winter grime parked a little apart from the trucks and old sedans. He had never really been from here. He just liked the way it made him look. Inside Iron Horse was all wood and neon, old beer signs, a couple of flat screens playing some college bowl game country music humming low in the background. The smell of fried food and spilled beer wrapped around everything. A few people sat at the bar backs hunched and a couple of guys in ski jackets played pool in the corner. Adrian sat at the far end of the bar with a glass of something amber in front of him. He wore a dark sweater, no coat, like he had walked in from a different climate. He saw me in the mirror behind the bottles before he turned a small curve at the corner of his mouth. The kind of almost smile that said he had been expecting this. I walked over and took the stool beside him without asking. The bartender gave me a nod and went back to wiping glasses. Up close, Adrian looked tired and well-rested at the same time, if that makes sense. Lines at the corners of his eyes, but no real weight there. People who live on other people's emotions sometimes learn how to stay light themselves. I told him we needed to talk about Rachel. He took a slow sip of his drink and said he figured that was why I was here. He said Rachel had told him I was upset. He used that word, upset. Like this was about me losing my temper, not about him moving into my daughter's life like a fog. I asked him what exactly he thought he was doing. With the loan, with the ring, with the secrets and the late-night calls. I asked him if this was a pattern for him, or if we were supposed to feel special. He laughed softly, said I was being dramatic, said the loan was a misunderstanding, something the bank had drawn up poorly, said the ring was a coincidence, that maybe Laura had lost it, and someone had found it and sold it, and he had bought it. Small world, right? Every answer was slippery, never quite settling anywhere. I told him I had spoken to Nolan, that we had seen the judgments and the shared debts, that I had gone to Spokane, that I knew he had been around Rachel back when she was still trying to figure out how to breathe without shaking. For the first time, he stopped smiling. He stared into his glass and swirled the whiskey. He said I was making a lot of assumptions. He said he had helped a lot of people through dark nights, and yes, sometimes feelings grew. That was the nature of human connection. He said Rachel felt trapped. By this town, by our expectations, by the way we always talked about safety and never about freedom. He said all he had done was show her another path. He turned and looked at me full on then. His eyes were steady, not drunk, not wild, controlled. He told me Rachel needed him more than she had ever needed anyone in that house. That in Seattle, when she woke up at 3 a.m. ready to quit, it was his voice that kept her from walking out. Not mine, not Laura's. There is a specific kind of fury that comes when someone weaponizes your own failings against you. I knew I had not been everything my daughter needed when she left for Seattle. I knew I had stayed too quiet on some calls when I should have pressed harder. Hearing that twisted into a justification for what he had done made my teeth hurt. I asked him if that was how he justified it in his head, that he was the hero stepping in where fathers and mothers fall short. I asked him if that story worked on him when he looked in the mirror. He shrugged, said most fathers just did not like being replaced in their daughters' hearts. Said I was no different. Then he did something I did not expect. He mentioned Laura. He said she had told him once after an outreach event at the community center in Dillon that she felt alone in her own kitchen. that I spent more time thinking about risk assessments than about what she was going through. He said she had cried in his office about how hard it was to raise a daughter in a house where feelings had to pass safety checks. He looked at me while he said it, taking my measure. It was deliberate, a scalpel sliding between old ribs. I remembered that winter. Laura had been gray and quiet. I had been working overtime trying to keep a project on track. We had argued in circles. I had known she was hurting, but I had not known she had taken that hurt to Adrian. Anger flared across my chest. Not at her, at him, for tucking her confession away, keeping it as ammunition for a night like this. I told him I did not care what she had said to him in vulnerability. I cared what he had done with it. He had taken a crack in our marriage and used it as proof that Rachel should not trust us, that she should cling to him instead. He leaned closer, the smell of expensive cologne mixing with the cheap bar air. He said Rachel was not a child anymore. She had made her choice. He said if I really cared about her, I would back off, let her live. He promised that if I kept pushing, I would lose her completely. Behind us, the door opened and cold air rolled through. I did not turn at first. I kept my eyes on Adrian. But then I heard a familiar voice call my name. Rachel stood just inside the doorway, cheeks pink from the cold hair tucked under a knit hat. Laura's Subaru keys in her hand. She looked out of place against the worn wood and neon. I felt my stomach drop. I asked her how she had found me. She said Laura had called an hour after I left, worried, and when she could not get me on my phone, she tracked the Subaru. Modern cars like to tell on you. Rachel walked toward us, eyes moving from my face to Adrian's. She asked what was going on, her voice tight. She said Adrian had texted earlier, said he was grabbing a drink alone, clearing his head. When she had not answered, he had sent another message about how he hoped tonight did not turn into a war. Adrian sat back a little, let her talk. He did not look surprised to see her. That was the worst part. It felt like he knew every move before we made it. I told her I had come to ask him some questions, that I needed to hear from his mouth why he thought it was acceptable to borrow her future to pay off his debts and to use our family history as his leverage. Before I could say more, Adrian cut in. He told Rachel I had been making accusations, twisting his work in Spokane, turning his efforts to help women into something ugly. He said her father had never liked him, that he had always wanted control. Rachel looked at me, hurt and defensive, fighting in her eyes. She said quietly that this was exactly what Adrian had warned her about, that we would try to drag him through the mud to keep her away from him. I tried to slow everything down, to pick my words like I was picking my way across ice. I said this was not about jealousy or control. It was about patterns, about what Nolan had found, about what the clinic had said, about that ring that had been on her mother's finger long before Adrian ever knew our name. She shook her head, said she did not know what to believe anymore. Adrian waited until that moment when her doubt was deepest to lean in toward me. He spoke low, just for me. "You think this is all about Rachel," he said. "You do not know half of it. You do not know what Laura kept from you about me." The words themselves were not complicated. It was the aim behind them that chilled me. He was not just trying to hold on to Rachel. He was reaching back into the history of my marriage and twisting the knife. And from the way Laura's name landed between us, I knew this was not the last time he would try. On the drive home from Iron Horse, Rachel sat beside me in the passenger seat, with her arms folded tight. The radio was off. The only sounds were the tires hissing over packed snow and the heater fan pushing lukewarm air at the windshield. She did not ask what Adrian had whispered at the end. I did not volunteer it. There were already too many sharp edges in the air between us. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than usual. The lights in the windows softer, like it was bracing for something. Laura opened the front door before we reached it. One look at our faces and she stepped aside without a word. Rachel went straight past us up the stairs into her room. The door closed just hard enough to say she was done for the night. Not a slam, but not gentle either. Laura watched her go, then turned back to me. She asked quietly how bad it had been. I hung my coat and told her he had done what he always does. Took bits of truth and bent them into weapons. I said he had spoken about her. About things she had told him during those old outreach projects. How alone she felt in our kitchen back then. How much she wished I would look up from work and see her. Laura went pale, then sat down at the edge of the couch. Her hands were in her lap, fingers twisted together. She stared at them like they belonged to someone else. I asked if she wanted to tell me the rest of it before he tried to do it for her. For a long time she did not say anything. The ticking of the clock over the fireplace filled the silence. Then she began to talk, slowly at first, then faster, like once the words came loose they did not know how to stop. She said there had been a winter when she felt like a ghost in her own home. I was working late at the plant outside town. The wind turbines needed inspection before a big contract renewed, and every night I came home tired and distant. Rachel was a teenager, then moody and closed off, and Laura carried everyone else's problems in her job at Summit Outreach. She felt invisible. She told me she had mentioned some of that at the community center one evening after a workshop. Adrian had been there packing up his notes. He asked how she was doing, not as a co-worker, but as a person. He listened, she said, in that quiet way he has. He told her she deserved to be heard, that being the strong one all the time wears people down. He said it must be hard being married to a man who saw danger everywhere and emotion nowhere. She admitted that for a short while she liked having someone hear her without dismissing her. Then she saw the way he started to look at her. Not as a colleague, not even as a friend, as an opportunity. She pulled back. She stopped staying late. She limited their conversations to logistics and schedules. Later she wrote that note and tucked it into the filing cabinet when her worry turned from herself to Rachel. She did not tell me because she was afraid we would fight about him, about her job, about my absence. She thought she was overreacting. Now she knew she had not been. She looked up from her hands and said she was sorry she had not told me sooner. There was shame in her eyes and something else. Fear that I would see her as part of the problem, not another person he had tried to pull into his orbit. I sat beside her and told her the anger I felt was not aimed at her. It was at the man who had taken our private failings and turned them into a map of how to reach our daughter. The next morning an email came in from Nolan. Attached were more documents he had dug up. Civil filings from Washington and Colorado, old loan agreement settlements. Different women, different amounts, the same script underneath. Adrian getting close through the programs and support groups, then their names appearing beside his on obligations when the money dried up. One case out of Spokane caught my eye. A woman in her late 20s met him at a grief group, ended up co-signing a line of credit for him. When he defaulted, she went through months of wage garnishment before negotiating a settlement. There were notes in the file about emotional distress, but no formal charges beyond the financial part. People rarely want to drag their pain through a courtroom. I printed everything and spread it on the dining table. When Rachel finally came downstairs, eyes, puffy hair pulled back without care, I asked her to sit with us. Laura joined, arms folded tight like she was trying to hold herself together. I did not raise my voice. I walked them both through what Nolan had found. I showed how often Adrian's name appeared next to women he had met through outreach work. I pointed to the dates, the overlaps, the similar amounts of money. I reminded Rachel how he had framed her involvement as a simple favor, a sign of trust, the same language he had used with others. At first, she defended him almost out of reflex. She said maybe those women had misunderstood, maybe the banks had messed up paperwork. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved slowly from page to page, from pattern to pattern, and I could see. The moment her mind stopped bending reality to protect the story she wanted to keep. Her shoulders sagged. She pressed her hands against her forehead as if trying to push back tears. They came anyway. She said it all felt like waking up from a long dream where the person holding you was the one who had pushed you off the ledge to begin with. She said he had learned every sore spot she had, her fear of failing at work, her loneliness in Seattle, the way she doubted herself whenever she disagreed with me. He had soothed each one in just the right way so she would lean harder into him and away from everyone else. Laura reached out, but Rachel flinched before finally letting her mother hold her. Watching them, I felt something heavy in my chest loosen just a little. Painful truth is still truth. It is the lies that keep you stuck. That afternoon I called Michael again. This time I did not talk in hypotheticals. I told him everything. The forged signature, the financial pattern, the clinic in Spokane, the tires, the message on Rachel's phone. He listened, then said we were past the point of private worry. He said he would open an official investigation file. Fraud, coercion, possible falsification of documents. Professional misconduct. He would loop in the district attorney and his contacts in Washington. He warned me that these things move slower than anyone wants, especially around the holidays. But he promised it would move. 2 days later, just as the snow started falling hard again, Michael called back. His voice was clipped all business. He said Adrian had abandoned his address in Spokane. Neighbors reported he emptied his place in the middle of the night. The clinic confirmed he had resigned from his consulting role without notice. His work phone was disconnected. His personal number went straight to a full mailbox. A man with nothing to lose and no fixed address is the last thing you want shadowing your family. That night, the three of us tried to eat dinner at the kitchen table, but no one tasted anything. The television in the living room played some holiday special on low-volume laugh track, bleeding through the wall like it came from another planet. Rachel went to her room early. I stayed downstairs pretending to sort mail. Laura washed dishes in slow circles. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Close to midnight, I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Rachel appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, face drained of color. She said she had gotten an email. I asked from who, though I already knew. She handed me the phone. The message was short. Adrian wrote that if she turned on him, if she betrayed him, he would expose things about her parents she did not know. Old secrets, past mistakes. The words were cold and possessive, like he believed he still owned not just her heart, but the narrative of our lives. I handed the phone back and told her the only thing I knew to be true in that moment. Whatever he thought he had on us, whatever stories he wanted to twist, he had already shown us who he really was. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, I could feel it like a pressure drop before a storm breaks over the ridge. We were out of illusions. What remained was simple and dangerous. He was somewhere out there without an address and without a job, and the only thing he had left to hold on to was the idea that we were still his to manipulate. Christmas Day slid in quietly like the snow that never really stopped. The sky over Dillon was the color of old steel, and everything outside the windows looked soft and harmless. Inside our house, it felt like we were walking around on cracked glass. That morning, I called a local security company in Silverthorne. Michael had pushed me to stop treating this like a what-if and start acting like a man who knew trouble was coming. By midday, a young technician in a beanie and work boots was drilling in slim sensors at the back door and the ground floor windows. He showed me how the system could send an alert straight to the sheriff if someone forced a lock. It was quiet technology, no sirens, just a signal that would go out whether we were home or not. Rachel watched from the living room, legs tucked under her, a blanket around her shoulders. She looked worn down, but there was a different kind of focus in her eyes, the kind you see in people who have finally stopped arguing with reality. Laura busied herself in the kitchen, pulling out the turkey she had planned days ago, determined to see something normal through to the end. She said it might help to do at least one thing we always did. I let her. Sometimes routine is the only thing that keeps your hands from shaking. By late afternoon, the house smelled like roasting meat and cinnamon. The tree lights glowed in the corner of the living room, reflecting off ornaments Rachel had made in elementary school. For a moment, if you looked only at those small details, you could pretend this was any other Christmas. But the folder of documents from Nolan sat on my desk in the back room, heavy as a cinder block in my mind, and every time a car drove past outside, my shoulders tightened. We set the table together. Rachel laid out plates and silverware in slow, careful movements. Laura lit the candles. I checked the new panel by the front door for the third time, making sure the system was armed. We ate quietly at first, then little by little conversation emerged. Rachel asked Laura about a story from when she was a girl in Denver. I told them about the time the wind farm froze up and we had to unstick blades one by one in a storm. It was not laughter, not really, but it was something warmer than the silence we had been living in. By the time we cleared the dishes and Laura started packing leftovers into plastic containers, the sky outside had turned fully dark. The porch light cast a small circle on the snow, and beyond that was just black. I was in my office straightening a stack of papers when I heard it. A soft metallic scrape, then a dull thud somewhere near the back of the house. Not loud enough to be a dropped pan, not the furnace, something different. My phone buzzed in my pocket at the same time. A quiet vibration, no sound. I pulled it out and saw a notification from the security system. Rear entry sensor breached, silent alert sent. My heart did a strange thing then, a mix of fear and grim confirmation. I stepped into the hallway and told Laura and Rachel to stay in the kitchen. I kept my voice calm, told them maybe a sensor was just loose, but something in my tone made them both go still. The back hallway off the mudroom was dim. I left the lights off, letting my eyes adjust. The air felt colder there, as if it had been stirred recently. The door to my office stood slightly ajar. I knew I had left it almost closed. I pushed it open with my fingertips. Adrian was in front of my desk, knees bent as he rifled through the bottom drawer where I kept household records. His coat was unzipped, hair damp from snow. He looked smaller in my space than he had at the bar, less composed, but his hands were still methodical. He did not notice me at first. For a moment I just watched him the way you watch a wild animal that has wandered into your yard, not sure yet if you can scare it off or if it will attack when cornered. I said his name. He jerked up, eyes widening, then narrowed again almost instantly, like a mask snapping back into place. He straightened, one hand still resting on the drawer. He asked why the evidence had to be hidden. His tone was light, but his gaze kept flicking toward the desk where Nolan's folder had been earlier. I told him he needed to leave. I told him the sheriff had already been alerted and that staying would only make things worse for him. I did not know exactly how fast help would come on a holiday night, but I trusted Michael's word more than I trusted anything coming out of Adrian's mouth. He laughed, a short sound with no real humor. He said no one in town would believe some story about him breaking into our home. He said he was only here because he was worried about Rachel, that he had received messages that concerned him. Behind me, I heard a sipped intake of breath. Rachel stood at the end of the hall, one hand on the doorway, Laura just behind her. I had not wanted them to see this, but it was too late. Adrian saw them and his expression shifted. He called to Rachel, said he had just come to talk, that things had gotten out of hand. And he did not want the bank or the courts involved. He said we were twisting his actions, that he had done everything for her, that her parents had never understood how fragile she really was. Rachel stepped into the office past my shoulder. There was a time not long ago when that kind of plea would have pulled her right back in. You could see the echo of it in the way her fists tightened. But something else was stronger now. She told him she had seen the files from Nolan. She told him she knew about the women in Pueblo and Tacoma and Spokane. She said she knew about the clinic and the loans and the way he always showed up when someone was at their weakest and called it love. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. She said she would tell the police everything she knew. She said whatever he thought he had on our family, whatever secrets he believed he could use, he no longer had her. For a second, Adrian just stood there, eyes darting between us. I saw calculation behind his pupils, wheels turning fast. Then something broke through the polish. Anger, pure, unfiltered. He moved suddenly, not toward her with open arms, but sideways toward the doorway, toward freedom. I stepped to block him, one hand up. He shoved my shoulder hard, harder than I expected. I stumbled back against the desk. Rachel flattened herself to the wall. Laura called out a sharp sound, more warning than word. Adrian made it into the hallway, boots slipping slightly on melted snow. He was heading for the front door when the red and blue lights washed through the frosted glass panels. A second later, there was a firm knock, not polite, not frantic, just practiced. Michael's voice carried through the wood, identifying himself, asking if everything was all right. Adrian froze. I walked past him and opened the door. Michael stood there, hat pulled low, breath white in the cold. Another deputy flanked him. They had already received the silent alert and rolled as fast as the roads would allow. I stepped aside. Adrian tried to compose himself, to spin some story about concern and misunderstanding and a mixed signal from a faulty sensor. But the sight of him in my house without permission, the look on Rachel's face behind me, the documentation Michael already had on his desk at the station, all of it narrowed the field. Michael asked Adrian to step outside onto the porch. The air out there bit at our skin. He told him he was being detained on suspicion of unlawful entry. He mentioned ongoing investigations into financial misconduct and professional ethics. He was calm. He did not raise his voice. Adrian looked at me once more, as if appealing to some shared understanding. There was nothing left to share. The deputy produced cuffs. Metal clicked around Adrian's wrists. For the first time since all this began, the man who had moved so freely through our lives stood still under someone else's authority. Rachel watched from the doorway, one hand on the frame. When the patrol car pulled away slow over the snow, she turned and her legs seemed to give way. Laura and I were there, one on each side, catching her before she hit the floor. She cried, then not the desperate tears of someone clinging to a dream, but the raw release of a person who has finally let go. She kept saying she was sorry, sorry for not seeing, sorry for defending him, sorry for the damage done. I told her a different thing. That she had nothing to apologize for to us, that the person who should be sorry was on his way to a cell. That what mattered now was what she did with the pieces, not how they had been broken. Later that night, after the paperwork and the statements and the phone calls, the house grew quiet again. Not the dangerous quiet of denial, but the kind that follows a storm when you can step outside and see what still stands. We sat together on the couch, the three of us wrapped in blankets, the tree lights still blinking in the corner. For the first time, I felt something close to the peace I had imagined when this season began. It was not the same quiet Christmas I had planned. It was one we had earned in a much harder way. If you are still listening to this and any of it sounds too familiar, if you have ever felt a storm like this blow through your own home, do not keep it buried. Share your story. Let someone else know they are not the only one who has been there. Sometimes the only way to keep the dark from coming back is to turn on every light you can and leave it on long enough for others to see their way through.